afternoon, and we're talking about Baghdadi's death. It's being investigated if indeed he was killed in that airstrike. What impact would it have if indeed he is dead?
Thank you so much, Betty. I think this time around, of course, they've said several that he's been killed, and it's always been not true. I think this time around he's been killed, it's true. And
you think he, for real?
It's possible he's died.
Okay.
And that is meant now to cause serious demoralization of the group, which means I think the anti-ISIS forces have made tremendous progress. So the lack of leadership, of course, leads to disintegration and friction. Yeah, so it's a weakening move.
It's a weakening move.
Yes.
Coming back home, remember a few years ago, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, you had the leader of the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. He was actually like, I think 2 or 3 leaders actually, and that had the same impact that you're talking about, that it became a bit weakened, and it takes time before they're able to find new footing. So is this really like an entrance into the war against terror on a bigger scale?
Yeah, I think that is it's a tremendous addition to the guys, of course, the governments that are pushing against terror. Because when we have the figurehead, as it was like in the case of Osama bin Laden, they get a sense of inspiration and someone to look up to. Once the figure is taken away, there is demoralization, as I said earlier, there's weakening, there is what we call now a lot of jostling for positions by the smaller commanders. And that leads to, of course, infighting and possible infiltration by intelligence agencies, which of course now leads to a takedown of the entire, as it happened with Al-Shabaab, of course, after those guys were killed, Al-Shabaab weakened a lot. Yes. And since then, I think they've not been able to recover. And the kind of attacks they launch are not on a bigger scale as it was. So that is it's a big advantage.
Also considering that the reports also indicate that about 30 other commanders, junior commanders were killed, and 300 other soldiers, so a total of 330, and if he's one of them, 331.
Yeah.
All right, so let's also talk about what has the war against terror done for the world in regards to the countries coming together to fight this thing.
Number one, of course, it's a unifying force, especially when you see the Americans and the Russians coming together to fight terror. It's a unifying move. Of course, there are so many differences between the Americans and the Russians, especially now that it's proven that indeed the Russians meddled with the American presidential election. So the war against terror provides an avenue for them to come together, at least for the time being. And then, of course, it's also formed some kind of rallying call globally, of course, because all governments now are set to fight terror. Recently, you saw what happened in the Middle East, where a bunch of governments decided to isolate Qatar. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Are we likely to see the impact or the effect of Baghdadi's killing here in Africa and in Kenya?
Of course, it's going to happen, and I expect the militants to be discouraged, of course, and the kind of support they were getting is likely to reduce. And of course, it might not be realized in the short term, but in the long term, it will be evident. And of course, in places like Somalia, it's going to be witnessed. It will take time. But still, there has to be a lot of pressure so as to make sure they don't regroup and get someone else. Yeah, it always happens.
You mentioned something to do with Qatar, and there are questions about really if the reason that they're being, sidelined is because of terror, funding terror, or, are there any underlying issues to do with gas now that that was discovered there? What has been the impact of this sidelining of these governments against Qatar to the whole picture of war against terror? Is it doing anything?
It is. Of course, the surrounding nations, the neighboring nations, have a big contribution in terms of business to Qatar itself, which means, of course, there's been a serious economic disadvantage. So the isolation is having a big impact on the country itself. And of course, we've seen some countries from beyond the Middle East, of course, coming in and saying, if it's like that, then I think we have to isolate you even further. And I don't think it's about gas. There has to be some kind of intelligence that has been collected over a long period of time for them to be able to take such a serious step. Yeah.
Are we likely...
Yeah, of course, that is a learning moment for so many nations like Iran. about support to terror groups. Yeah.
But there are critics who are saying that what they're doing to Qatar, it's like two best friends who are used to doing the same thing for so many years, and then one backs out and then starts to castigate the other.
I don't think so, because if Qatar had evidence about the participation in support of terror groups by another country, I think by now they could have outed them. Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of information which has been collected over a period of time. And I think there's a time it was said as a rumor, I think like 2-3 years ago, but there was no action which was followed. And I think before the nations took that kind of action, they had to get support from, let's say, like the CIA and the MI6 and all that.
All right.
Yeah.
What would be the role of the United States in this whole conversation and these discussions between these countries in sort of like coming to the table and having an agreement?
I think the point is the Americans are trying to make very sure that the avenues for support to terror groups dismantled completely before Qatar can be accepted back into the community of Middle Eastern nations. So that is the kind of pressure I think I expect the Trump administration to apply strongly. The problem is, of course, there is now the element of legitimacy of Trump as a president, which of course hampers his ability to coordinate events overseas. But I think that is the kind of pressure that is going to be applied on the country itself, so as to make sure that kind of support is stopped.
But does it make sense having, the union that is formed in the Gulf to deal with the issues instead of having a foreign, intermediary coming forward?
Now, there's what we call disregard for some neighbors, and maybe let's say the Egyptians or maybe the Saudi Arabians, they might not be given the kind of respect the US will be given.
Okay.
So that pressure from the US and maybe Russia and the UK will have much more impact than what maybe the Egyptians might want to do.
All right.
Yeah.
In the long run, what are we likely to see if this goes on for a long time? What are we likely to see when it comes to Qatar, in terms of development? Things just basically running, because right now they're really between a rock and a hard place.
Of course, you can expect serious economic disintegration within the country itself, but I don't think it's going to end there. At some point, they'll have to come to the negotiating table and have a conversation, which of course will lead to some kind of concessions from Qatar itself, and the neighbors have to accept. But of course, I think they've put forward some kind of measures and steps Qatar has to take before it can be accepted back into the Council, the Gulf Council of Nations. And with the pressure, of course, from the US and the UK and the rest of the international community, I expect Qatar to, listen and concede.
And to concede.
Yes.
All right, let's now leave things terror and talk about what's happening in London. I mean, it has been quite a crazy 2-3 months for the UK.
Yeah.
Theresa May finally came up with her minority government, but still, on the other hand, Corbyn is always, almost all the time, hitting her really hard. Are we likely to see her making any moves, and especially with the talks to do with Brexit? Is she going to have an impact really with now where she is?
Well, last time I predicted that she was going to win. Of course, yeah, she won. It was not as decisive as was expected, which of course now has created problems. She will have problems, of course, given the erosion of support for the Conservatives. And I think it's going to be healthy, because the policies she put forth as a Prime Minister now have to be checked. Every single move she makes has to be carefully, thought out before she can roll out. And, that is the role of a very strong and robust opposition. And for the sake, of course, of progress and economic recovery of the UK, Jeremy has to monitor what he says. He has to be very careful so as to make sure it's not some kind of deadlock for the UK.
He had actually called for Theresa May to resign,
which she didn't do.
Things are thick there.
Yeah.
But also talking about that tragedy, 30 people have been confirmed dead. And police are saying that number could actually escalate to 100.
Yeah.
And people are criticizing Theresa May because they're saying she has not gone to visit the survivors. Is it that she's busy handling other things? Comparing her to Jeremy Corbyn, who has been talking to survivors, apparently each and every one of them. Is it the whole place of the majority of the population is rallying against Jeremy?
Well, what's happening is I think she's facing a lot of pressure, and in the process she's making some missteps. When she decided to go to visit the guys who are helping, the responders and all that, she should have extended the visit, of course, to the victims. So it was a misstep. Now she's promised she's going to pay them a visit. And Jeremy is a populist. So when he gets a moment, he sees it very quickly. And so I think the criticism is okay. It's in order. And what we need to understand is she's under a lot of pressure. She just got the kind of support she didn't expect. In fact, the party lost the support in the elections, and she's being criticized. And of course, recently we had terror attacks, and there's so much that is going on.
That's going on.
And I think she underestimated the leadership of the country. So she's bound to make some mistakes here and there. So it's upon the opposition to understand, and instead of so much criticism, they need to support her.
All right.
Yeah.
Talking about that fire tragedy now, Grenfell Tower, many of the people who were living there were from foreign countries, from Syria, refugees who are coming from war-torn areas. And the hosting country really, and talking about the people who were there are very many questions that are being raised. That, first of all, this was a building that was surrounded by a very high profile neighborhood. There are people who were saying earlier on